I know the team creation deadline was about an hour ago now, so I hope everyone has had a chance to meet some new people and had a great start to your projects. So, welcome to our next talk. Sarrah Lal has joined us today to give us her top advice for aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators. Sarrah is the co-founder of Cultura Diagnostics and brings over 10 years of experience in business development, educational health technology, and higher education. She also holds a faculty appointment and leadership roles at the Michael G. DeGroote Initiative for Innovation in Healthcare at McMaster University. Sarrah has directly supported entrepreneurs and companies in her roles, so she has a lot of info to share with us today. Without further delay, Sarrah, the floor is yours.
Hey everyone, how's it going? Hope everyone's doing well. I'm sure you've had a really busy day so far. It sounds like you've been hard at work with your teams developing out some ideas. And I hope what I'm going to say is going to have some relevance. The title of the talk is really focused on survival of the most adaptable. And so by no means, you've probably heard that entrepreneurs need to be adaptable. They need to be able to change with changing circumstances. But I think sometimes the limitations of what that means are kind of unnaturally kind of narrow, because usually we think about resilience. You have to be able to overcome challenges, and there's no real direction on what those challenges might encompass. And in the work that I do with entrepreneurs, it's been quite clear to me that the challenges that we usually deal with are from inside. Our own biases, the way of thinking that we usually come into things with. And so I wanted to spend a little bit of time working through that. This is going to be a talk with mainly me talking, obviously, but I welcome any and all questions. And if there's any questions that you want me to address live, like it's kind of related to a point that I'm making and I can elaborate to provide a little bit more information, please do feel free to just let me know. And I have the chat like a little later right beside me, and so I can see that as things are coming in. Okay. And then we have some time for Q&A at the very end. And I'll pop my email address into the chat afterwards, just in case you want to chat with me afterwards. I'm always happy to have conversations. So one of the first things that you've probably already realized is that coming up with an idea, it takes work, but it doesn't take that much work. And it's usually the simplest and kind of the easiest starting point for getting an innovation process going. And so I will say that oftentimes when we come up with that great idea, it's not necessarily based on the information that we get from other sources. It's based on our interpretation of the information from other sources. And so oftentimes the first thing that we actually need to become more adaptable in is actually going through and critically assessing what we've come up with and adapting to new information as it comes up. Okay. So for example, let's say we have this idea that we want to develop a new wearable, for lack of a better example, a new wearable that is able to track declining mobility over time. And we say that, oh, look, that's going to help us make interpretations of how people are actually aging. And maybe we can help prevent some aging related mobility conditions that may actually occur over time. And so that sounds like a great idea, right? But once you get into actual conversations with people, you start to learn about things like seniors don't really like to wear wearables, let's say. Or we have some information about, oh, actually, there's very little published literature about the fact that mobility changes actually can be tied to people getting older, and therefore we're working off of basically no data. And so there is something to be said around having a great idea, but it's something else to say that you have an idea that you've kind of put through various lenses and various perspectives, and you've kind of beaten up the idea a little bit. And by beating it up, you find that it actually holds true or it doesn't hold true at all. And based on that determination, you can either invest more time and energy into that idea or not. Okay. So that's the first thing about being adaptable when it comes to actually putting an idea forward and being an entrepreneur. It's being able to hold on to the fact that this idea has potential, but not so strongly hold on to it that you kind of become delusional as part of that process of putting the idea forward. Okay. The second thing I want to mention is that you can't really conflate the topics of invention and innovation. These are two different things. So invention is the creation of something new, the creation of something new that has really never been done before. It's usually patentable. It's something that provides utility of some sort. It's non-obvious, and therefore it's able to contribute to humanity in some way. However, an invention is hardly ever like the sole source of value. Usually you find inventions like the phone, for instance, to evolve over time through innovation to actually be able to produce even more value. And so that obviously lends itself into something called innovation, which is putting together things that actually have been created before. And through that assembly of things that exist, you actually are able to enhance the value or the nature of how a problem is being solved. And often we kind of conflate the two because we think that as an innovator, you need to be a genius. You need to like create something that's never existed before. When actually, in reality, it's often a reconfiguration of reality to be able to address something that has never really been done. And so when we kind of talk about innovation, we have to get away from this notion of there being a genius who is able to kind of create things de novo and move more so into a realm where we actually just tweak things to have more features, or we rethink the business model of how someone gets access to something, or the level of expertise that's required to do something, or the networks through which things are connected and therefore able to be useful for other types of individuals. A lot of the time when we talk about innovation, we talk about things like blue ocean and red ocean. Okay. Blue ocean meaning opportunity areas that have never really existed before, and red ocean meaning opportunity areas that have existed before, but they're really competitive. There's a lot of different entities that already play in that space. And so often when I think about invention, I think about things that maybe don't even fit into either category because there's no real use case for them yet. But once you start to layer on value and bridge into that innovation space where you start to associate things with things that people understand already, you veer more so into the blue ocean strategy, maybe red ocean, but usually blue ocean strategy. And then you're able to kind of get better at pitching the value that you're creating, and then you're actually going to be able to build something out. Okay, but invention is not innovation, and so one of the other things in which you have to be adaptable is kind of distinguishing between the two, and being able to, as an innovator, be able to look around the world around you and come up with new ways of actually doing things. To that point, that brings me on to the third kind of thing that I want you guys to become better at. It's to always have a growth mindset. A lot of the time when we think about people kind of pursuing education, becoming a certain thing, so becoming an engineer, becoming a doctor, becoming a business person, we kind of see them as locking themselves into that specific realm of operating. Okay. And I will tell you that a lot of the people that you've probably already associated as being innovators have actually done a lot of work on themselves to be able to learn about things that they haven't traditionally touched in school. Okay. So not to talk about Elon Musk all the time, although I do like him, he's an excellent example of someone who's very often actually looking at new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. And he actually pushes himself to understand the core essentials of various domains. Okay. So having a growth mindset means that you don't just restrict yourself to a single way of thinking. You actually have to open yourself to other forms of the world being kind of seen. And so when we're engineers, we look at things in different ways. When we're business people, we look at things in different ways. When we're clinicians, we look at things in different ways. And so if you look at some of the greatest entrepreneurs out there, you'll note that they've at least in a piecewise fashion been able to assemble all sorts of different experiences from advisors, from personal experience, from actually pursuing further education. And they're able to come up with different ways of doing things, different ways of understanding the world around them because they've had those different forms of exposure. Okay. There is an increasing awareness and kind of recognition of the arts also within the innovation space. And I think it's because we value creativity and we value different ways of assembling reality, and we associate that very, very commonly with art. And so when we think about storytelling, don't mind the background noise. When we think about kind of creating new ways of like viewing the world through stories, through the ways that art is put together visually. When we think about even dance, all these things are actually the assembly of known entities, like notes or paper or paint or anything, and kind of reconstructing it into formulating a new reality or representation of reality. Okay. And so when we think about kind of exposure to different things and having that growth mindset, just encourage you to always keep an open mind. Even going to a conference that seems to be completely outside of your comfort realm often has the positive effect of actually teaching something new, priming you for information that you probably would otherwise never have come across, and also giving you connections to people who also will be able to potentially help you in your innovation quest later on. Okay, so that's number 3, kind of have that growth mindset. Another way of needing to be more adaptable, a lot of the time when I think about higher education, and remember that I am an educator, that's part of what I do, and I teach a few courses at the undergrad level. I teach resident clinicians, I teach medical students, I even teach some of my colleagues who are also faculty members in leadership. And so sometimes when I speak to individuals, I begin to realize that one of the things that you're not taught at all, or you're taught very superficially, is actually talking to people who are different from you. And so in my classes, I come across this because people are put into groups. They have different ways of organizing projects based on their program of study. They have different ways of articulating the exact same thing based, again, on their program of study. They have different ways of understanding how team dynamics are supposed to operate. So more cooperative versus more like divide and conquer strategies, again, based on their program of interest. And so a lot of the time when we think about entrepreneurship, and I know that you're all in groups right now, you're all working together, but I just want to flag that maybe in your groups, you have a lot of people from similar backgrounds. Maybe in your groups, you have assembled them because you're friends and you get along. That's fantastic. I hope that you mostly have groups that you work with in the future and now that you're getting along with. But it's really, really important for you to also learn how to get to the point of getting along with people that you don't naturally get along with from the very beginning. Okay. Some of my most productive relationships are with people who will tell you how it is from their vantage point, and you'll actually get into a bit of a discussion, an internal debate. I'm not going to call it a conflict, but like some people would call it a conflict, and you get to the best outcome at the end of the day because you were able to have those conversations. Okay, so be adaptable in who you're able to talk to, not just the perspectives you're able to take on because of your varied experiences, but who you're able to talk to, how you're able to talk to them, how you're able to leverage your interactions with them for the common good of the project, and ultimately sort of distance yourself from thinking that it's all personal. It's not personal. You should be able to work with other people to be able to maximize the outcomes of what you're doing. Okay. Another thing that I want you to become more adaptable in and kind of pursuing entrepreneurship is get away from this notion of perfection is the goal. So optimization is the goal. Perfection is something you're never going to achieve. Sorry. You're going to get close to it, but there's always going to be a new way that pops up or a new insight that determines that there's more work to do. And that's fine. But I think that maybe, and again, I'm an educator, right? So take that in mind. I think that you're probably getting a bit of a disservice done to you by having education framed around being successful if you get like an A+, because what you're pursuing is actually as close as possible as you can get to 100% knowledge acquisition, which is determined based on your ability to apply that to tests, to projects, and then based on that A+, you'll then put that forward to an application to some end kind of school that you want to go to. And there's nothing wrong with this, okay? This is just how the education system is designed to work. But I want you to get outside of that kind of thinking when it comes to the projects that you're working on from an innovation perspective. You are always going to be learning. It is going to be frustrating because sometimes you'll find that you were going down a rabbit hole and you just weren't doing things the right way. And then you kind of have to pivot. You have to go in a different direction. Sometimes you're going to find that information is changing as you go, not because you were going down the wrong rabbit hole, but because there's just emerging academic literature that's coming out, or there's a new healthcare professional that you've never talked to before, and now there's like a new insight. And so that's all fine, but it shouldn't be as frustrating as it is insightful and positive in terms of how you're viewing it to pass on to your project. So get away from thinking that everything has to be perfect. That is not the goal. Optimization is always the goal. And always, always, always be open to the possibility that you may never actually get to an A+ version of a project, but you're going to get to a point where people are going to want what you've developed. And that's actually what the goal is, right? The goal is to solve the problem. The goal is not to get the solution perfect based on what you've been told at one point in time, but that no longer holds true. Okay. And then one last thing that I wanted to kind of get into is really try to think about who you're bringing in as your advisors, as your team members, not just from the perspective of having diverse skill sets and disciplines represented, but also think about people who are going to give you critical feedback. And so this is being adaptable, not just from the perspective of being able to interact with different people, which I've already covered, but it's adaptable with respect to being able to recognize that you are separate from your project. And therefore, any feedback that you're finding, any kind of critical kind of like feedback or criticism, just positive or negative, it actually doesn't matter. Any information is good information. And so when you're looking at teammates or advisors or mentors, there's often something that we say in the entrepreneurship space, which is that if someone is not giving you any feedback that is negative, okay, like they are pointing out negative things, then that means that they are not doing their job and you should fire them. Okay. So actually within academia, I know we love it when people tell us we did a good job. We love it when our friends are supporting us and not really putting question marks around the things that we're doing. But actually the most helpful of advisors, the most helpful of confidants, mentors, colleagues are people who will point things out in a way that others are either just ignoring or are completely oblivious to. And that gives you the heads up that you need to steer in a slightly different direction. Okay. People that you are trusting to be your mentors, people who you are trusting to actually give you that feedback, that's their job. Their job is to give you kind of like an indication when there's a red flag of some sort. And so you should always, always, always be on the lookout for those types of people who are willing to give you the feedback that you don't necessarily want to hear, but you need to hear it in order to move forward with your innovation and be successful. Okay. So there's just different types of adaptation. I'll try to list those off again just to jog everyone's memory. But afterwards, I'm really open to questions. And if someone's got like even something about your projects that you want to talk about, I'm more than happy to make myself available. But we probably should keep it to the questions around what I've talked about so far. Okay. And don't forget, I've worked with a lot of different companies. I have a company of my own. I teach this stuff. Building resilience within my students is a really important concept to me because I think that a lot of the time we sugarcoat what we provide as feedback in courses, but there's an inherent kind of discrepancy there because people who want to innovate will obviously be facing challenge. You're resisting the current state of the whole system, right? And so you're going to have to grow a thicker skin just naturally over time. And you're going to have to learn that if you're uncomfortable, if you're facing resistance, often that's actually a good indication that you're actually changing how things are going to be done. Okay. All right, so the first thing that I said is that you need to stop sticking to only things that are inside of your head. So being adaptable means that you're adaptable to your way of thinking. Second thing I said is that you need to be adaptable to thinking about distinguishing the concepts of invention and innovation. So don't get locked into thinking that you need to be some sort of genius that discovers something in a lab and that's going to translate into an innovation. It's not always. Innovation is ultimately taking things that exist and reassembling them into something that could positively impact reality. Okay. So just make sure that you're distinguishing the two in your head. Next thing was around always having a growth mindset. There is great value in dabbling in your experiences and your education in the types of people that you talk to in order to become more creative. Creativity is not something that you're just born with. It's something that you gain through exposure. You are inspired by the things that you see. You are inspired by the types of things that you hear. And that is quite literally the reason why a lot of the time ideas come, like they migrate between industries, because you have someone who's like come out from the supply chain space and they've taken some of those processes and they've come into healthcare and they've helped to streamline everything within their hospital. Okay. Oftentimes people who work in other spaces are best suited to address the problems in your space because they are simply thinking about things in a completely different world. And you actually need components of that world to get infused into your world in order to make things better. Next thing I would talk about is that it's really important to surround yourself with new types of people. So oftentimes when we come into group settings, unfortunately, we migrate to be with people who we get along with the best. I do it, you do it. We don't seek out the people that we think are frenemies or we don't see eye to eye with at all. Okay. It's just not what we do. And so when you're looking at kind of becoming more adaptable, more entrepreneurial, you want to really, really, really focus on identifying about yourself. What exactly makes you nervous or makes you uncomfortable around interacting with people that you don't really see eye to eye with. And in investigating that, oftentimes you may find something curious exists because, for instance, someone may just be more vocal than you. Okay. And you like to be quiet and you like to kind of think through everything. So they're actually pushing you to be faster to verbalize your thoughts and patterns of thinking. Okay. But you could learn something through interacting with them and they could also learn something from you too, maybe not talking as much. Right. And so there's those kind of behavioral changes that you can see. But also when it comes to like people from different disciplines interacting with each other for the first time, oftentimes when you think about someone coming from business, for instance, business is kind of, people like to say that business is all about making things up. It's not. And then science is all about proving things, and it's also not. Both things, both disciplines actually work in a kind of weird harmony because science is all about dreaming up what a future could look like and then designing experiments to see if you can approach that and kind of prove whether something's possible or not. Whereas with business, in my experience, it's been a lot about kind of dreaming up a future and then seeing what their reaction or response is to it. And so oftentimes salespeople get a bad reputation because they're sort of like putting things out there and they may not completely be true. But oftentimes what business is about is kind of putting something out there, seeing if there would be traction or kind of like a positive response because people are interested in that kind of a thing. And then you kind of say, okay, you know what? It would be worth investing resources and energy to actually pursue that moving forward. Okay. And there are areas of science like grant writing where you do that too. You kind of need to dream up a vision and kind of articulate why this would have any relevance. But it's an example of how different disciplines may just inherently think differently and how you can learn from each other. Okay. Then in terms of other things that I discussed, really, it's important for you to get away from that perfectionism mentality that you've no doubt been getting better and better at over time. And so I had to get away from this. It's been a long time since I was in undergrad, but I do remember in my first years of university really being devoted to getting that A+, really being devoted to learning things exactly the way that they're kind of written down for me. But I think that my pursuit of a degree in chemistry actually helped me overcome that relatively quickly, because chemistry is all about dealing with experiments that aren't working, kind of catching things as they're failing right in front of you, adjusting the pH, adding more of this, adding more of that, kind of, playing around with heat. It's interesting because it's kind of like cooking, right? But both of those areas, cooking and chemistry, really help you kind of become comfortable with experimentation. And I wish more academic programs were just allowed for experimentation and kind of pushing the boundaries more often, but they don't. And so where you can kind of take advantage or kind of take control of that is that by recognizing within your entrepreneurial journey, it's quite different. And so don't pursue perfection. You're never going to get to an A+ version of your company, an A+ version of your product, unless you are exactly meeting the needs of the consumer base that you're looking at. It's not based on some rubric or some kind of preconceived notion that you had at the beginning of what it's supposed to be. It's an intuitive evolution of what you're doing, and you're ultimately going to get to a point where, yes, you're going to be excellent, but it's not based on like something that someone can give you as a framework. Okay, and that's largely what education's all about. And then I think the last thing that I mentioned, and gosh, I wish I remembered what I mentioned because there's one that I'm missing. But I think the last one was around being open to, for people being open to critiquing your idea. And this is something where I think there's a little too much fragility about this right now. We don't seek out people who say negative things about what we do. We don't seek out people who say negative things about us. Actually, one would argue that it's toxic to be in a relationship or any kind of friendship with someone who criticizes you all the time, right? But within entrepreneurship, it's slightly different. I'm not saying find toxic people. I'm saying find people who you trust. And in that trusting relationship, you are able to provide critical feedback that will ultimately give you insights that you didn't think of inherently that will ultimately help your idea, your solution, your go-to-market plan, etc. Okay. And if you don't find that you're getting that from your mentor or your advisor, and they're always kind of just clapping and saying, "Oh my God, great job," probably not the right person. Okay. So be adaptable in your understanding of how feedback works. Feedback works to get you better. It's not a criticism on you on a personal level. It's a criticism of the project. And the great thing about the project is that you don't need to invest in therapy. You just have to invest in more work. Okay. So with more work, your project's going to improve. And ultimately, all your project is doing is solving a problem for people. Right. And so the problem belongs to them. They understand it the best. And so let them guide you. Let others also guide you if they have insight that is relevant. And then you're ultimately off to a better place. Okay. So hopefully that's helpful. Those were 6 different things to just think about in terms of how to be more adaptable, because entrepreneurship really is survival of the most adaptable, not necessarily going to always be the most resilient per se, just the most adaptable, the most able to change, and kind of learn through trial and error what actually is the best course of action given your particular project and what you're trying to do. Thank you. So we're at the half-hour mark, and this gives us a lot of time for questions, but I'm hoping that there are some, just so that we can keep the conversation going.
So thank you very much for a very informative talk. If you have any questions, just put them in the chat right now. But as people are talking, I had a question myself. So you talked about what we should expect for feedback from people that are assigned to do that for us. But how do we ourselves give good feedback for projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. So how do you give good feedback? So I think it's important, first of all, to understand the limitations of your own knowledge. So you are not going to be an expert in like the problem space that someone's trying to address. But you can, through your kind of lens, offer a perspective around things like, does this actually solve the problem? Okay, so asking that question actually triggers the person who's on the end of actual development of a solution for them to think through how it actually would work, and they would explain to you how this would modify the current system. And as they're explaining it to you, oftentimes what emerges is whether they're actually addressing the issue without any consequences, or they're actually addressing the issue and they're creating a bunch of different problems, or there's a lot of other things that are going on in the system that they don't necessarily understand, like what the impacts would be on those. And so sometimes flagging that to them through that kind of a conversation is actually very informative, because it gives them more questions that they need to answer for themselves later on. So that's one tactic. Another tactic is to question whether this is truly unique. One of the biggest issues that entrepreneurs have is they don't actually do a competitive intelligence analysis, which sounds silly, but it's like you've conceived of something in your head, and then you never actually look to see if another company is doing it. You don't look at the patent literature to see if someone else has conceived of something and has already protected it. You haven't looked at the academic literature and seen if something else exists, okay? And so a lot of the time asking that kind of a question also requires no real insight, right? But it's a question you can ask to get them to give you feedback. And if they don't have an answer to that question, then the feedback is you should probably do a little bit more due diligence and understand exactly who you're competing with and how. And then one last way to just kind of quickly talk about things without necessarily having deep understanding, because I think that's often what you get at. Like if you don't have entrepreneurship experience, you want to give feedback. Another question to ask is how you're protecting your idea, and that leads into intellectual property. And very few people have a good understanding of IP. Unfortunately, we don't teach it as well as I think we should within the undergraduate or graduate space. And so it'll, again, push them to answer that within their own heads. And if they're not able to answer it, then it's like, okay, maybe you should talk to someone who knows a little bit more. So I could address some questions, or could really talk to people in Milo to just help them out too. Yeah,
Okay,
those are like 3 quick ways to get it. Alice actually asked a question. Do you want me to read it out?
Yeah.
Sure. All right. So Alice says, what kinds of ways we can find opportunities to experiment if we haven't been lucky in finding them? As you mentioned, the feedback is important. How can we be able to find the people to provide the right feedback? Lots of interest in feedback. Okay, cool. So Alice, it depends on what you're doing. Okay, so if you are at the stages of trying to understand if your solution actually addresses a problem, you have to talk to patients, okay? Or at the very least, you have to talk to healthcare professionals. And the great thing about having McMaster with having a medical school is that you have a lot of clinicians, okay? You have a lot of researchers who are doing work in the space. And so I would encourage you to, as step 1, to actually reach out to them. But step 2, to get access to patients, there's actually, and I'll put my email in the link, but or in the chat, sorry. But I'm directly connected to the patient advisory groups at HHS and St. Joe's. And you'd actually be shocked maybe at how willing a lot of these patient advisors are to talk to innovators like yourselves. And so that's an easy way, again, just to get in touch with people who actually know what you're trying to address, and then get into the right conversations. Now, when it comes to having insight on other aspects, so if you're not in healthcare, for instance, but you want more generic advice, I always recommend people just to go and become members or clients of places like Innovation Factory. I always recommend that you go and take courses in the Innovation Minor. I teach them, Glenn Crossley teaches them, Ken Owen teaches them. And like, we all have different areas of expertise. So you have to kind of choose your prof a little bit wisely. But in those classes, oftentimes we have projects in which you literally work through like an idea solution pair, right? And so that's an excellent way to just get direct access to people who do this kind of work. And the better thing about us is that we also have networks. of people who are from engineering or from specific industries in business, or from, again, the healthcare world, if that's your area of interest. And we can make those direct connections for you to actually get you into conversations. And within 15 to 30 minutes, you usually get quite a lot of feedback from people like that. Okay. Hopefully that helps. But just remember that when you're going in for feedback, you probably need to prime them with like a description of your solution before you get into conversation. So always kind of have in your email like a short blurb about what you're doing. Usually having like problem, solution, and impact in that like paragraph is important. Okay, so those 3 points, and then give them enough notice for them to be able to read that in advance. Okay. Second question. How would you recommend going about receiving sponsors to assist in your endeavors? Working on a case study that is working towards a greater goal with a perfect speaker for me and my father, who's really bonded through music, limited my accessibility to resources. Okay, so money, that's what you're asking about, right? Money. Oh gosh. Okay, so the problem with money is that usually when you're talking about grants, they're tied to very specific types of projects, right? And so when you're in healthcare or you're in engineering, it's often pretty straightforward to find something that addresses the type of work that you want to get into. You just would really benefit from having a PI on your side as like the applicant for the grant. Okay, so that's one kind of way of answering your question. But given that what you are describing doesn't seem to actually be there, I would encourage you can reach out to me as well, just to kind of have a longer discussion. But often governments do have more niche, kind of like specialized programs that aim to like serve some kind of an underrepresented need. So right now, a big thing is mental health as part of kind of the COVID-19 recovery strategy. And so if you're kind of aligned with that, like it could be a way to get government funding, but not necessarily have institutional support behind you. But another way of thinking about things, and it's even the way that I'm approaching things for my startup, even though like we're in the health tech space, it's through crowdfunding. So if you think that there's like broad appeal in the public to support what you're doing, it's actually not that much to ask for people to donate like $25, $50 towards your cause. And depending on how much money you actually need, so it doesn't sound like your project is really that expensive, but let's say you need $5,000, that's not that many people, you know? So if you have like a solid base of people who are supporting, and you can just ask them to help you raise a little bit of money and spread it with their networks, it actually is quite possible for you to be able to achieve that level of funding through crowdsourcing or crowdfunding rather. Hopefully that helps, Alex.
All right. That's all the questions I see in the comments so far. So I actually did have another question.
You do? Okay.
So personally, I'm in the engineering program. And when we work on different projects, we're mostly surrounded by people that have similar perspectives as us.
Yeah.
So when we're working on those projects, how do we focus on new perspectives and really fostering that growth mindset?
You know what? This is so I think oftentimes, oh, you're in high school. Well, good job. Good for you for moving forward with an idea this early on. Good job, Alex. Okay, so fostering a growth mindset in a group of people who are like-minded, get new group members. Just kind of joking. No, I think it's everyone's responsibility to always be on the lookout for furthering their education through reading or through having hobbies, which I understand is hard to do when you're in school. But I think it's everyone's responsibility to sort of always try to expand their worlds in those kind of like hobbies and books and everything kind of ways. But in the absence of such, there are exercises like design thinking exercises that I find to be quite good at enabling creativity. And it can even be as simple as having some wacky brainstorming exercise. So often when we do those, we actually push maybe this is something that you could do, but there's an exercise in design thinking where you can actually come up with terrible ideas to solutions, to problems rather. So instead of having like the goal of the brainstorm session to actually be come up with a really good idea, have almost a competition for the worst idea. The worst way, the way that would definitely not solve the problem, like it's illegal, like it's just like wrong in many ways. But doing that actually gets you thinking more creatively about possibilities. And so if you, after that session, have a session around just like coming up with different ideas, again, wacky, but like in the positive direction, you actually find that having those pre-exercises to just like stretch your thinking and how your mind works helps immensely in getting some good ideas at that more positive brainstorming session. So I think if you're limited to who you have on your team, you can flex your creativity, but you just have to do a little bit more work beforehand to get yourself thinking in that direction, because you don't inherently have that like different thinking in the conversations because you're all from similar backgrounds. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. I never thought about thinking of bad ideas.
We often don't, but it's an excellent way to really get the creative juices going.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And this will be the last question, unless there's more from the chat.
Yeah.
Um, I think you mentioned the idea of blue ocean and red ocean in
Yes,
innovation.
I did.
Um,
Yes.
where did the idea of thinking about these topics as oceans come from?
Oh, it's based on shark waters. So if you're in a red ocean, there's a lot of sharks that are kind of like hunting. And so it's a cutthroat environment. It's bloody. It's not a space anyone wants to be in, but you're really competing with everyone to get to your customers. And so red ocean space means that you're competing based on price, you're competing based on like limited features, you're competing based on partnerships. Like the margins of competition are really narrow. It's kind of like, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, like all those different fast food restaurants. They're all in like red ocean because there's a pretty saturated market out there. They're all kind of like cutthroat with one another. And if another like group wanted to create a company that competes with them, it's like, good luck at this point, because it's just so saturated. Whereas blue ocean would be the reverse. So like maybe there's a shark, but there's like literally no like food there. So a lot of sharks don't tend to go in that direction. And so there's lots of opportunity. But the downside with blue ocean often is that people don't understand that there's a problem that needs to be solved. So an example for blue ocean that I always use is with Uber. Because yes, the cab industry existed, and yes, it was pretty ruthless in terms of like probably being a red ocean at that point. But what they did was they actually disrupted based on business model. And now instead of having to rely on there being a fleet, there being dedicated cab drivers, they now opened up the notion of being a driver to a broader population, the notion of being a vehicle for being kind of driven around town to the average person's vehicle. And so they really shifted that model of operating. And it was definitely blue ocean until more and more competition came in, and then it became red. But at the beginning, it was blue. And what they had a lot of in the beginning days, if you remember, is resistance. I still remember when I first used Uber or wanted to use Uber or like thought about using Uber, I was so confused. I was like, what do you mean? And get into a car with a stranger? I'm not getting into a car with a stranger. And so that's oftentimes what a blue ocean approach needs you to work through. It's kind of that notion of, it seems like it would provide a lot of value and you can write a really good business case about it, but the adoption is really hindered by preconceived notions of what the problem actually is and how it could be solved. But if you get enough traction, so a lot of people kind of like through discounts, they got a lot of people on board, then ultimately you convince the population that this is a good idea, then you're in the clear. But blue ocean usually takes a lot of work. It's easier because there's more customers there, potentially more people who are adept at potentially being consumers at the end of the day. However, for you to actually get to them, you have to clear a lot of hurdles, usually from a cognitive perspective, for them to actually adopt. Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to
Okay.
thank you once again for your
Yeah. Thanks
great
for
talk.
having me. Hmm.
Thank you for answering everyone's questions as well.
Yeah.
And
Thank you. Great questions.
I think we can end it here now.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you get some extra time, 15 minutes to take a breather, and good luck with the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.